Hey guys, thank you for joining us for another Men's Bible Brief. This is Pastor Autry. If you can, join us on Wednesday mornings. The info is on the screen. If not, we got you covered right here on YouTube. Well, let's go ahead and join the brief in progress. God bless you. Hey guys, thank you for joining us for another Men's Bible Brief. We're in chapter 6 as we go through The Measure of a Man by Gene Getz. Before we jump into our lesson, let me give you the hump day food for thought. And here it is: when you have a friend that's going through a personal storm, instead of being a weatherman and spreading the news, try being an umbrella and cover them with love. I think that's a good word. And so hopefully and prayerfully that'll be encouraging to you. Today's lesson, guys, it comes again from chapter 6, The Measure of a Man by Gene Getz. And we're entitling this A Man of Respect, or better, A Man's Language. And I think that's really what Getz is after. And he's focusing on 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, and he's looking at that next word, respectable. And that word respectable actually comes from our English word cosmetics. And if you know anything about cosmetics, cosmetics makes you look presentable on the outside. Now understand, the scriptures nor Getz is suggesting that we ought to be something different on the outside than something on the inside. He's not promoting hypocrisy in the least bit. No, his point is that we have a responsibility to represent Christ well. It's kind of like my mom and dad. When I would go out for the night in high school, I would go out in the streets to play. My mother and my father were quick to say, don't go out there and act like you don't have any home training. And their point is, don't go out there and act like you weren't raised in the Archery household. You're representing us. That's the sense of what is meant by respectable, or this word cosmetic. It's not trying to push some kind of hypocritical Christianity. No, we've got to remember we represent the Lord of hosts. We stand as his children in the world. And when people sample the children, they get a sense of what the Father is like. And so I want to encourage us on that. And so very quickly, matter of fact, I used the example, Carl Ozan, one of our members at our church, he did a discussion at the men's retreat, and he gave us these dog tags. And if you can see it, it's a tag of a spiritual armor that's built on Ephesians 6. And I usually wear it with me as a reminder that when I go into the world, I have to represent Christ, but I'm also dealing with spiritual warfare. And as most of you want a man of God that represents God well. Many of you probably left the faith or left the church because of what you perceived or heard to be true about something a pastor did or some preacher did. Because there's certain expectations you bring to the faith. You think a man of God ought to carry himself, and he ought to. He ought to carry himself in a certain way, even though that has nothing to do or change the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. And so just like there are good pastors, there are going to be bad pastors, but that's another point. But the point is, we all bring certain expectations to the man of God or the pastor. Why would we think otherwise when it comes to us as followers of Jesus? In the same way, as brothers, we bring certain expectations of our spiritual leaders, our pastors. So also too, guys, make no mistake, somebody's watching you. Whether your children, whether your spouse, whether your boo, whether your family, whether your boys, it doesn't matter. Somebody's watching you. They know you're a Christian, and there's certain expectations. Let me be very, very clear here on one point. This Western idea that promotes a Christianity, what I call a Gnostic Christianity. You'll have to look up that word, Gnostic, a Gnostic version of Christianity, which means as long as I have the information about Jesus, I'm saved. And so we give people this impression that somehow when I get to heaven, I'm just going to take a quiz. And if I pass the quiz, I'm in. No, God is in my life through Christ to change my heart, to change my behavior. It's not what I know, it's how I live and whether the gospel has impacted my life. Don't be fooled by the lie, guys. It's more than just getting information in your head. We have to get transformation in our hearts. So let's be clear on that. And so Getz here, he raises 3 questions about how we ought to present ourselves as respectable men or men with language, which I'm kind of codifying this message. What about our external experience? How do we present ourselves? Is it appropriate? What message are we sending? What about our homes or our places where we live? And then number 3, which I think is the bulk of his chapter, is what about our speech? And here specifically, he's dealing with profanity. Profanity. Is it appropriate for a man of God to loosely and routinely use profanity? And let me just say a few things, and I really want you to think about it. This is not some, religious clubbing that we're going after, to club you across the head and to make you religious police that looks down on other people. That's not the goal. The question is God trying to shape our language and our behavior and our hearts, that we're respectable men wherever we are, whether in our family, our community, or in our culture and our churches? A couple things very quickly. Number 1, Jesus used strong language. You won't find where Jesus used profanity, but you will find that he used very strong language. He called religious leaders vipers, snakes. He called them whitewashed tombs, which were very strong derogatory words in that ancient time. So he did use strong language. He did not use profane language. But it should be stated that some of the biblical writers did use profanity or profane language. Not going to go through all that, but usually the English translations do their best to clean up the profanity. But make no mistake, there's profane words in the scriptures. Not going to go through that. But even in those instances, the biblical writers are making a theological statement, and they're trying to shake their audience awake, trying to get their attention. And so even there, they're not using it loosely. They're not using it because of the culture. They're using it for theological reasons. And number 2, the second thing I want to say is that profanity has now become a way of life. It's just acceptable in today's culture. 40 years ago, when I was coming along in my 20s and 30s, there were just certain things you just didn't say in the public square. You didn't say anywhere. You better not say it at home. Today, it's just acceptable. It's in our music. It's in our movies. It's in the mainstream culture. You see an athlete do an interview, or an entertainer or an actor do an interview, even a politician, and they're going to use some form of profanity. And so it's a part of culture. Some of you were raised on that with hip hop. You were raised on it in your music. You were raised on it in your culture, and it's just a way of life. Here's my fundamental issue. Does it take away from your representation of Christ? Do people draw the wrong conclusions about you and God with the use of profanity? And then the second thing for me is, does it demean the image of God, the Imago Dei, in other people? One of the foundational principles to the Black church is that we matter to God, the Imago Dei. The early slaves understood that though we were enslaved and oppressed by slave owners, we were not slaves. We were God's children. And that's what the appeal was of the Christian faith. The Christian faith says, regardless of your ethnicity and regardless of your social standing, you are a human being that deserves equal treatment. That is the gospel. And so my concern is demeaning. And so there's certain words I just won't use. I won't use the N word. I just won't. Even though I know Jay-Z said there's certain words that can be redeemed. But if you look at the history of it, it's a slur. And it's not, and many times people have an issue of appropriating this word as if whites could use it. Exactly, that's the point. So you want to use it, but you don't want anybody else to use it because you know you can be sly. You can code switch in how you use that. You can use it one way and mean something else. And Jesus clearly condemned that kind of usage when he talked about calling someone Raka. It's a slur. It's a demeaning someone's character. So for me, I'm not going to use the M word. I think if we understood as African-American people how the MF word was used in slavery, we'd stop using that today. We'd just stop using that, particularly as much as we value our mothers. But I don't believe you can redeem the N word. Nobody's trying to redeem the B word with sisters. Maybe they are, but nobody's trying to redeem coon or pickaninny and these kinds of words. And so this idea that you can redeem it, I think it's just ludicrous. It demeans, it's a slur. It disparages the character and the humanity of someone. So that's my issue there. Get suggests also, too, that that profanity is an issue of insecurity and anger. And it may be an issue of insecurity. I'm not so sure if I agree with that. But I will say this. I think it definitely intensifies anger. And one of the reasons why, as a pastor, I've tried to stay away from profanity. I'm not going to state to you, even on this video, that somehow I've been profanity free. They told me young in the faith that you're not really a good preacher unless you use a profanity word every now and then. And that's just a code amongst preachers. And so this idea that preachers don't use profanity, that's a lie. Hey, don't get it twisted. So here, I'm not trying to say I've been profanity free or obscene word free. But what I am saying is, for me in my own walk, whenever I use profanity, what I found is it takes me to the line of anger. It many times cross the line. And many times I don't trust what I might do to somebody when I cross the line of anger. There's a sense that an extreme rage or hatred rises up in me. And I think many times we don't consider that. Profanity intensifies our anger. The other thing I would say is that, particularly in the African American community, I think we've been raised in terms of men that somehow profanity is a rites of passage, that somehow the use of profanity proves my manhood. And I'm sorry, I want to challenge you to know your history. Number one, it is God who makes me, who has made me, that gives me identity in terms of who I am. But then number two, I challenge you as African Americans to go through your history, to go through your cultural history, and to see if you find it, and you won't find it, that we valued ourselves, we valued our dignity. And many of the profanity that we use in the modern era is the result of the slave experience, the Jim Crow experience, and not the result of culture. And we've hijacked culture in order to profit from it, to use those words. And so that's just my perspective. You can disagree. The last one, though, and many times not talked about, is the whole idea of blasphemy. Blasphemy. That is, you can use profanity in a way that demeans the very name of God. And so the GD word, that God condemns somebody, is in a sense, is blasphemy. Who are you to take the position of God to determine whether God condemn somebody? You know, in some spaces in America, you know, Jesus Christ has a middle name, if you know what I'm talking about. And so there, you're kind of demeaning the name of God if you're not careful. And so here, it's just the blasphemous way of using it. And I'm going to quote my wonderful mother-in-law here on the issue of profanity. And here's what she would love to say. She said, profanity is a sign of one who has a very limited vocabulary. And what she meant by that is that there are ways that you can use language, as many of our artists and musicians use today in their music, to use language to get their point across without using profane words to demean someone's character. And so those are just my thoughts on this profane issue. As a rule, I think as Christians, we have to ask ourselves the question, is that something I can use in prayer? Is that something that reflects the very character of God? Someone's always watching me. I know we're in a culture of profanity, and sometimes we have to engage people with the gospel who have a high use of profanity, so we can't act like it's not there. Definitely not trying to be judgmental on it. But at the same time, guys, I want to push you to think about, how does profanity coexist with my faith and how God is transforming my heart? That's the big issue. And so, very quickly, questions that I want to raise, your discussion questions for today. Number one, would you consider yourself respectable? And in what ways do brothers need to be more respectable? Number two, what are your thoughts about profanity and the Christian faith? Should profanity be a part of a man's vocabulary? And then number three, does profanity intensify anger? Does profanity give us a false sense of manhood? What are your thoughts just in general about profanity? God bless you guys. Love to hear your thoughts in the chat. If you can't do that, I'd love to check you out on the Saturday Rewind, because I know this is a discussion we need to have. You need to chop it up with some other brothers, and hopefully you can make it. God bless you. See you in the next video. Take care.